welcome to a review video. In this video, I'm going to be talking about moral saints and the Immoralist challenge. So to start with moral saints, Susan Wolf, the writer of this paper, she gives a preliminary, broad definition of a moral saint. That is a person whose every action is as morally good as possible. And if moral saints exist, I think she's rightfully kind of skeptical to admit whether she actually thinks they exist or not, or to take a stance on whether they actually exist or not. If they do exist, though, they could be grouped into two categories. The loving moral saint, their personal happiness lies in the happiness of others. So, again, maybe they do exist, and maybe Nelson Mandela falls into this category. He got great fulfillment out of helping the people he did, and he seems incredibly pleased with this choice. His personal happiness may have lied in the happiness of others and helping them. There's also the rational moral saint. Their personal happiness does not lie in the happiness of others. Again, if people such as these exist, maybe Mother Teresa might be an example of the rational moral saint. Mother Teresa helped many people. She dedicated her life to helping people who were less fortunate than her. She saw death regularly or every day, bandaging wounds of injured people and holding people's hands on their deathbed. This made her incredibly miserable and depressed. It did not make her happy, certainly, but nonetheless, she continued to get up and do this every day out of a feeling of moral obligation, so that she might be described as a rational moral saint. And Susan Wolf's argument is pretty simple. The first premise is no moral saint has any non-moral virtues. So what are non-moral virtues? A few examples are like skills like music or athletics, knowledge like knowledge of history, literature, philosophy, hobbies or interests like cooking, certain personality traits, maybe like coolness, that's a virtue, but it's not a moral one, so on. That's a brief list. The list goes on for much longer, for sure. Her defense of this premise, so she says, why is it true that no moral saint has any non-moral virtues? As a practical matter, moral obligations are infinite. They always end up crowding out non-moral virtues. So there's never going to be a time where Mother Teresa is like, well, my moral obligations here are done. So glad I helped everyone. I'm going to go paint a beautiful picture. There's always going to be more. The moral demands are infinite. There's always going to be more that she could be doing to be more moral, something that would be more moral than her working on a non-moral virtue. There's always going to be something like that. Insofar as she wakes up one day and decides to paint a beautiful picture, instead of help other people, she ceases to be a moral saint. She's no longer a moral saint, because now not every single one of her actions are as morally good as possible. She's choosing something that's morally subpar or slightly less morally good. The second premise is the good life requires some non-moral virtues. To defend this, Wolf kind of looks at, well, first she says, and you might intuitively agree with her, a life without non-moral virtues is strangely barren. It's kind of empty when we think of someone who was very good but didn't develop any skills, hobbies, interests, or areas of knowledge in their time. We might think their life sounds strangely empty or unfulfilling. But even if that doesn't convince you, you can look at who are your role models. Think about that to yourself. Who are your role models, or a role model in your life? And the truth is most of our, if not all of our role models have well-developed non-moral virtues. So just as an example, this is Professor Barker. Professor Barker is a role model, not just because in a moral sense he's kind, but for his non-moral virtues, such as knowledge or expertise in philosophy, which I might aspire to have too someday. His commitment to being a good teacher, if he was more committed to being a moral saint and helping at soup kitchens every single day, he would have less time to be a good teacher, and he wouldn't really have the time to develop the non-moral virtue of being an incredible teacher. But, I might look up to him, and some of you might look up to him for that non-moral virtue of being a good teacher, not just for the kindness part. So that's one example. So the good life requires some non-moral virtues. That seems pretty intuitive, especially if we look at our role models and why we consider them role models. So therefore, the good life is not the life of a moral saint. This is a sound argument, or, you might take issues with these. It's certainly a valid argument. If you take issues with these defenses, we don't talk about any in class, but maybe you do. But I think on the whole, many people are convinced by this argument. Many people tend to really like this argument, and they find it pretty intuitive. So there's that. And to transition to the Immoralist challenge. And you don't need to know this, but one way you can think about, just to segue these a little bit, Wolff has shown us that the moral life, or the good life, is not the life of moral perfection. Nonetheless, I'm still inclined to be, to try to be moral in many ways. I don't read Wolff's argument and think, let's say I'm fully convinced by Wolff's argument. If I find a wallet on the ground, I still want to return it to its owner. I'm still inclined to volunteer when I can, and I'm not a moral saint, but I'm still inclined to do moral things. Again, you don't need to know this, but just one way to segue here. And the Immoralist challenge, what Plato is discussing in the Republic, or this part of the Republic, the challenge is the question, why should I be moral? We've already determined, and maybe we're convinced, that we don't have to be perfectly moral, but why be moral at all? So why should I be just / be moral? So this is a debate between Socrates and Glaucon, as depicted. A dialogue that's used to, explain Plato's philosophical ideas here, but he's using his teacher Socrates as a bit of a mouthpiece, which is not necessarily important for you to know, but... So dialogue, here's an incredibly oversimplified version of the dialogue. The question is, why should I be just or moral? Socrates says, well, you should be just or moral because justice is intrinsically desirable. In other words, it is desirable in its own sake, or in and of itself. And Glaucon disagrees. Glaucon says, actually, Socrates, he's playing devil's advocate here, if you remember from the reading, but let's portray his stance as the following. Justice is only instrumentally valuable. So instrumentally valuable as in we desire being just for the sake of something else. You can think of it, one comparison a student brought up is volunteering is a good thing to do. Many of you probably had to volunteer in high school because your high school required you to do 100 volunteer hours for your graduation. You were being moral by volunteering, but you saw being moral there as instrumentally desirable. Most people, in this case, they were volunteering for the sake of graduating high school, which is of their own self-interest. And, Socrates isn't stupid, I guess, in that way. He would have to concede sometimes, things like that happen. However, justice is much more than that. There are many, and if not most cases, where we act justly because it is intrinsically desirable. Glaucon is instead saying every moral or just act we do really isn't that different from volunteering in order to graduate high school. It may be less obvious, but at the end of the day, we still only ever behave justly because we want something else out of it. It's an instrument for something else. Maybe we want people to like us or so on. So, of course, Socrates asks, he notices he disagrees here, so he asks why. Again, very simplified version of the dialogue. So Glaucon is like, well, justice is only instrumentally desirable because, and we phrase this as another question. So this is called Glaucon's test, is how it's put in the notes. And the question is, if we gained nothing from being just and faced no punishment for being unjust, would we still behave justly? two possible answers. If yes, if we weren't afraid of consequences or wanted rewards for being just or unjust, if we still behave justly, then Socrates is right and we intrinsically desire justice. If not, if put in a scenario where we don't get any reward for being just and we don't face any punishment for being unjust, if in that scenario we behave completely unjustly, then Glaucon is right. Then we only instrumentally desire justice. So, yeah, Glaucon says, no, we wouldn't. If when placed in the scenario where we don't get anything out of being good, and we don't face punishments for being unjust, we would not behave justly. And to support this point, he brings up the Ring of Gyges myth. So in the Ring of Gyges myth, Gyges of Lydia finds a ring where if he spins it in a way, he becomes invisible. Gyges, an ordinary shepherd, I believe, up until this point, with this power that he now has, he realizes that he can be unjust, he can be horrible without facing any consequences. And with this power, he seduces the queen, he kills the king, and he overtakes the king's throne and becomes the new ruler. He gains a lot of power, wealth, of course, from these horrible, unjust actions. So Glaucon's point in bringing this up is that Gyges, for example, and really Glaucon thinks any of us, you hand the ring to any of us, and we would do, maybe not the same thing, but we would do the same thing, and that we would also turn to unjust behavior. So Gyges or anyone else was only ever behaving justly out of his own self-interest. If you had asked Gyges before he found the ring, Gyges without the ring, you're like, Gyges, you're a good person. Everyone likes you. You don't seem power hungry whatsoever. You seem like a pretty just person. Why are you just? Gyges, or the correct answer for Gyges would be something like, I'm just because I want people to like me, or I want people to do business with me, and being a dick would interfere with my business practices, and I don't think I could get away with being totally unjust and just like killing people. Truth is, if he tried to overthrow the king, he would probably end up in jail or executed. He couldn't get away with any of that. But as soon as he could get away with it, then he no longer behaved justly and did all these things that maybe he really wanted to do all along. Therefore, justice is only instrumentally desirable. So Gyges, in this case, Gyges of Lydia, not only is he not facing the consequences for being unjust, he can get away with killing the king and doing all these horrible things without any sort of punishment. But when you think about, is he still rewarded for being just? And maybe he would be, if he remained a pretty good person and maintained a pretty good image perfectly justly with the ring on, he would still get reward from that. However, notice that he gets a much greater reward from being unjust. And it's such that, it really seems like now, by comparison, he's barely rewarded for remaining just. I mean, think about the reward he could gain by being unjust, which he does gain. He behaves unjustly, horribly, and he's rewarded immensely. He gets the power, he gets wealth, power, influence as the new king. So really, yes, he's still maybe rewarded if he behaved justly, but the reward for behaving unjustly is so much bigger, and that's what's in his self-interest now. Whereas before, the reward for behaving justly, maybe people liking you, people doing business deals with you, that was a decent reward, and gaining that reward was in his self-interest because that was important to him. That was probably the best thing he could do. And avoiding punishment, that was also in his self-interest. He obviously didn't want to be in jail or be executed for his crimes. So those are just some things to think about regarding moral saints and the Ring of Gyges. You could think, I mean, you could disagree. You could say, actually, I'm uncorruptible. If I had the ring, I wouldn't do anything unjust. And you'd be disagreeing with Glaucon. I would encourage you to think about that more, if that's your stance. Think about whether you agree more with Socrates that justice is intrinsically desirable, or Glaucon has convinced you, and you lean towards him being correct. There's no right or wrong answer, but those are just some things to consider to help you think about the material. And yeah, that's about it. Thank you for watching.